I think there's a case that every panel chair could make that their session is relating to the most important topic of the moment. And I'm going to make that case as well. Identifying victims, increasing legitimacy in communities and with the people that we deal with, those are absolutely core principles for the service. And not just in England and Wales, this is a around the world challenge at the moment. In the last 10 years, arguably, we've faced greater challenges to our institutions, not just in policing, but in all walks of institution. And legitimacy is the weak spot. If we lose legitimacy in policing, then we're going to lose our effectiveness more or less overnight. I think that one of the greatest challenges to that legitimacy is police misconduct, which is a sad thing to say, but it's catnip to big media. The stories of police misconduct mount up. If you do a quick Google search right now, you will see about a dozen stories from the last week of police officers who have been sacked from UK police forces. That's just in the UK. I just briefly looked up the statistics just before we did this session. 1 in every 100 officers in England and Wales, officers and staff, last year was investigated for for misconduct. And one in every 200 was found to have a case to answer. Now, you get the sense from just sort of opening your ears and eyes that misconduct is a challenge. But those figures kind of, and I deal with figures all the time, those figures really caught my attention. So in this session, you're going to hear from 2 different speakers who come from slightly different positions and backgrounds about trying to take policing into a place where it can police itself more effectively using 21st century methods, which is a continuing theme of what we teach here in Cambridge. The first speaker, Detective Inspector Paul Tomlinson, is kind of a living embodiment of the MST. Paul has, 26 years service, which he probably won't thank me for mentioning. And in the last 2 years, he's been through the journey that all students here at Cambridge go through in terms of taking some of the principles that we teach and applying those to their day job. Paul works in professional standards, and the presentation he's going to go through, he will be talking through his recently completed dissertation. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Sarah Valdebenito. Sarah's been associated with the University of Cambridge for 11 years, I think, as an MPhil student, then a PhD student, and latterly as a research associate in the Violence Research Centre. And Sarah's going to pick up the baton from Paul and talk about the continuation of the work that Paul has started in a broader environment with the College of Policing.
So I lead the Sussex Anti-Corruption Unit, and professionally I was drawn to this area of research because it struck me that after an individual had been investigated, or during the course of that, people would quite routinely come forward and say that they'd always thought there was something a bit wrong with that person, or that they'd never really trusted them. But there was never any particular evidence behind that. They were just people's thoughts and feelings. And it struck me, working through this process, that it would be really great if we could use information that we already hold in policing to try and identify those that perhaps are more likely to commit acts of career-ending misconduct, and in doing so, as Matt described, damage the legitimacy of policing. So the MST programme gave me that opportunity to dig into this really important area to see if there are any differences between police officers that have been investigated for allegations of gross misconduct compared to their colleagues who had not. And at the time I was developing my research, which seems like a little while ago now, but in reality I don't think it really was, the UK government had just announced that they were almost halfway through recruiting the additional 20,000 police officers that are due to be on the streets by next year now, so 2023. But shortly after those announcements came a flurry of news stories from around the UK where serving police officers had committed really quite serious criminal offences, the most serious of which was the murder of Sarah Everard, which we'll all remember from the media reporting last year. And that theme has continued. And in fact, in March this year, HMIC, in their annual State of Policing report, highlighted the danger of unsuitable people being recruited to become police officers, which is really likely to be exacerbated by that ongoing mass recruitment drive that we have around the country. It therefore seemed to me like a really good opportunity and a really great time to see what we could do to improve on this situation, to try and make it better, and certainly to try and understand it more. Which is why I settled my thesis and research as a case control analysis of risk and protective factors for gross misconduct for serving police officers. And that research involved comparing 17 characteristics that were determined beforehand, and all of that information was obtained from the recruit application form. So again, going back to we've got that information already. And we looked at the information from 100 police officers from Sussex who had been investigated for allegations of gross misconduct over a 5-year period, and to see how those characteristics, or if those characteristics, differed from officers that hadn't been investigated. We had a cohort of 200 police officers that had joined at the same time as those individuals who'd been investigated, but they hadn't themselves been subject of any gross misconduct investigation. And just for clarity, we solely focused on allegations of gross misconduct. If you're all experienced in policing, there's obviously a hierarchy of allegations that can be made, but this focused solely on those potentially career-ending allegations that are made against officers, so only gross misconduct. And if individuals are found, those allegations are proven, that could result in their dismissal and ultimately inclusion on the College of Policing barred list. The case officers themselves were made up of individuals that had applied to join Sussex Police between 1987 all the way up to 2015. So there was a real broad range of experience in that sample group. And all of them required the review of those 300 application forms. And over that 28-year period between 87 and 2015, I think it's fair to say those forms had changed quite significantly over that time. But they were really consistent in providing that snapshot of that applicant's characteristics at the point that they had applied to join Sussex Police, before they'd been signed up and before they had been exposed to the role of policing in any way. And it was really important for Sussex Police, and probably any replications of this, to make sure that that data is managed really carefully. There's a lot of personal information within those forms, so we were really careful in the way it was presented in the findings to make sure that no individual officer or officers could be identified from the way that the publication was written. And the case group themselves were made up of 82 men and 18 women. They had an average age of 25 at the point they applied to join Sussex Police, and they were investigated at between 2 and 29 years service, which again I think gives that real breadth that you've got people that are really new to policing, just having done 2 years, right up to 29, which in the UK typically that would have been towards the end of an expected 30-year service. Interestingly, the research did show that 28% of those 100 officers who were investigated had between 14 and 17 years service at the point that allegation was made. And further exploration is probably needed around why that particular time is vulnerable for those type of allegations. The method that I followed for the analysis of the findings was odds ratios. And they were used to describe how much more likely it is that the officers who were investigated would possess those 17 characteristics than officers who were not. I then used confidence intervals to calculate how confident we could be that the odds ratio reflects the population that the research was drawn from. In this research, I used a 95% confidence interval, so statistically 95% of that population should fall within the upper and lower confidence intervals. But at my presentation to the Thesis Oversight Committee, they did suggest that it is 95% the right confidence interval. Or are these matters so really serious that we could perhaps think about 75%? Or are some of the traits even more serious that we don't even need to be 75% sure? So if anyone's looking at it, then I'd urge you to think about what confidence interval are you comfortable with and where should we be working with that? On this slide, this is an overview of all of the results from those 17 characteristics that I tested. And it shows a real spread of the predictive values for those characteristics, with the least predictive at the top of your screen, working its way down to the bottom where you have the most predictive characteristics. And really strikingly, 14 of those characteristics have an odds ratio above 1. So that's dots towards the right-hand side of the orange line, indicating that the case officers were more likely to have those characteristics than the control officers that they were compared against. And the further that dot is away from the orange line, the more likely that characteristic is to exist, the more predictive it is, and the higher the odds ratio. You can see there towards the top of the screen, though, there are also 7 where we're either on the line or to the left of the line, meaning that they don't have that effective predictive value. But the odds ratio, those dots, as you can see, only tells part of the story from the broad range of confidence intervals, which are the lines to the left and right of those dots. And it really then does start drawing in how confident we can be that they are those effective predictors. The top band of characteristics there all have an odds ratio of 1 or under, indicating that they're not effective predictors. So that's the box right at the top of your screen there. And perhaps those characteristics are actually more likely to be present in the control officers than they were the case officers themselves. And that was interesting for me because some of the literature that I looked at indicated that certainly some of those characteristics around employment types should have been effective predictors of future poor behaviour. The middle band all have odds ratios of above 1, but again you can see there because of the lower confidence intervals, we can't really be certain that we could use those as effective indicators of future poor behaviour. It's really relevant to say, though, that the majority of those that are poor indicators, or certainly not effective indicators, suffered with really small sample groups. So the bottom 9 on your screen there had 10 or fewer officers in those respective control groups. And part of that then is the real push and need for this needs to be replicated. It either needs to be replicated on force levels or preferably nationally to see if we get more people in and analyse their data to see whether these are either consistent findings or whether anything different is there. This really draws focus on the predictive effect of education and prior police employment. And the focus view here shows that the top 10 of those predictive characteristics, or combinations of those characteristics, all include a lack of higher education, a lack of further education, or previously having worked for the police in a voluntary role or a civilian role before joining the police service, or having been a transferee from another force. So really powerful around education levels or previously having worked in the police at all. And thematically, that education and prior police employment are interesting and really could do with further exploration around why is that? Why are those particular areas so relevant in predicting future poor behaviour? It's also worth saying here that we don't know what the effect the current police degree entry routes into policing will have on this. And that's particularly important because my research, the most recent officers were 2015, so I don't have anyone in my cohort who came in on any of the degree entry programs. So that might change things and something I think that is worth being really alive to. And while I've mentioned a few times, the sample size was relatively small for my research, just 300 officers. What this table does show, though, is that the analysis is really clear in respect of those top 6 most effective predicted characteristics. All of these, as we touched on, have an odds ratio of above 1. The lower confidence intervals are all well above 1, and all of these results were found to be statistically significant. And if we take that top predictor, having no A-levels, if we take the odds ratio at face value, officers who don't have A-levels at the point they apply to become a police officer are 19 times more likely in this research to be investigated for an allegation of gross misconduct than officers that do have A-levels at that same point in time. The upper confidence interval being almost 35 is again really strong, but as is the lower. Even if we had to accept that it was 10 times more likely, that is a really significant indicator around future poor behaviour in respect of that one characteristic on its own. And again, an interest for me was the people that had worked for policing before. And in my mind, I would have thought that meant that they understood what was required of them, they had had training around what's acceptable, and they'd worked in policing or for the police and understood what was required of them. But this research shows that those individuals are almost 3 times more likely to be investigated because they have that policing background. And that again for me leads further digging into to really understand why that is and why that fact is there. As I mentioned at the beginning, I found this a really interesting area to work on, but I also genuinely think it's really important for policing to understand who we're recruiting and to make sure that they are the very best people that can take that mantle of policing and can take this forward in what is becoming more and more of a challenging role. But the results from my research are based on a really small sample just from one UK police force. So I'm not standing here today saying that this is in any way, shape or form ready to influence a policy change or to influence how we're recruiting police officers at the moment. But what the research has hopefully done is shown the potential to show what we can achieve or what we can achieve from the information that we already have available to us. And I would really like this to be able to contribute towards the start of a journey to make police recruitment more evidence-based. And what's really needed now, and I know Sarah will come on to this, is further replication. We need these studies either to be replicated in forces or preferably on one national basis to test whether my research and its findings are accurate, whether they're replicated in your forces, nationally or regionally. And the future research, I also think, should focus on officers who were dismissed, so found guilty of an allegation of gross misconduct. Owing to the sample size I had to focus on investigations. And again, we will all know just because you've been investigated doesn't mean that that ends up with a sanction, a finding, or indeed any indication of anything that you've done wrong. So the College of Policing barred list would be an ideal source for future case officers. And again, that would represent all forces in England and Wales. The information that I based my research on is really readily available during that recruitment process. So before you've offered a job, before we've accepted anyone through the door. Therefore, it should be relatively straightforward for forces who want to participate in any national or regional replications to provide that data, to find out who those officers are and compare them to individuals who have not been investigated. And that data then could be collated centrally and analysed centrally, and that would benefit not only policing in the UK, because we'll have one database that looks at all predictive characteristics, but it will benefit your individual forces as well. You'll understand what the demographic of individuals who are investigated in your forces looks like. And working to create that national model that can predict individuals who are more likely to cause future harm at the point of application, I think genuinely got to benefit everyone in the police service and definitely the public that we serve.
So what I was saying is that I'm very satisfied of hearing the results presented for Paul, and I think we are all very thankful of your transparent presentation. What I'm going to do today here, it's not talk about research findings, and you are probably surprised because of that. My aim today in this presentation is talking about a program of research that could potentially help to reduce misconduct, to predict misconduct, or take actions to prevent the prevalence of misconduct. As my previous colleagues have mentioned, this is a very sound problem for the UK, but not only for the UK, but also for other countries. In 2029, the Prime Minister informed public that 20,000 new officers were going to be recruited to be incorporated in the forces around the country, well, actually England and Wales. So this blurry figure here shows the increase in the recruitment of these new officers. As you can see, even if you can't understand the numbers, this shows an interesting trend towards the aim, which is 20,000 by 2023. In 2021, the government was celebrating the fact that they had reached almost 50% of these new officers. 50% had been recruited. But at the same time these news were shared with the public, we hear about the murder of Sarah Everett, which was a horrendous crime committed by a member of the force. This unfortunate news has been shocking for the population, but also for all the police forces. And although we know that the prevalence of misconduct is quite low, in the US, for instance, 2%, we also know that the impact of a minority of officers who abuse their position cause significant damage to the public confidence in police. So in that broad context, we have been discussing not a new study. This is more a program of research that in sequence could contribute with the forces to prevent these events. The general aim of this program of research is to develop, let's say, a reasonably accurate predictive model for criminality or gross misconduct in a community of 140,000 people who happen to be police officers in the UK now at this point. So this general aim can be implemented by 3 studies. The first of the studies that we are proposing is the replication of Paul Tomlinson research in Sussex, covering ideally the 43 forces in England and Wales. It means we want to use a retrospective design where we compare those officers in the barred list, which is a list managed by the College of Policing, where you have all the cases of police officers dismissed by the force by case of misconduct. So we would like to take all these cases and replicate the study that Paul has presented across the UK. In this list, we have around 1,100 police officers, and that means that if we select 1 or 2 cases of control, we could have a study with 3,000 participants, which of course would increase the impact and also the precision of the study. When Paul was showing the slides and showing you these very wide confidence intervals, most of this range is given for the small sample size. Once we add more participants in the study, these confidence intervals could be narrower, and therefore our results could be more precise. So that is the first study, a replication of the case control design. On the top of that, we have been thinking about using information that is already available in the police force in a prospective analysis, taking 50,000 of newly hired officers since 2018 to create a predictive model that allows us to understand which are the strongest predictors of misconduct. The third study in this set or in this program of research is what we have called a dynamic forecasting. So basically the idea is to keep working with this cohort of 50,000 newly hired officers, but instead of taking a picture of the predictors and the subsequent misconducts, we would like to do this forecasting model dynamic. So if I predict today, these are the risk factors, and this is what is going to happen in the future, I want to know what is happening 1 month later, or probably 2 months later, or 3 months later. So we can probably develop a tool that is dynamic in the way it uses and report information and forecast misconduct. I will try to explain very briefly these 3 studies, and the reason why I would like to explain it is because obviously you could play a role in the production of new evidence on this topic. The first study, as I said, is the retrospective case control design, a replication. We will try to identify the best predictors of police misconduct using local data from the UK. We have for that the BARD list, which at the moment is public information and involves 1,100 cases. And we would try to match the cases in that BARD list with some control cases, right? So using that model, we try to minimize bias, because probably the most ideal strategy would be an RCT. But in topics like this, where the randomization is something quite serious, it's almost impossible to think about randomization. So this study could give us information about what predicts misconduct in the UK. This is very initial. This is a map of the 43 forces in England and Wales. The 1,100 cases are widespread in different regions. As you can see the numbers, I put here some examples. As you can see, the numbers are not huge, right? We know that this phenomenon is not massive, but still very impactful. So there are good news and bad news about it. First of all, the numbers are very slow, so that is a good news because it implies collection of data for a reduced number of individuals, which can be easier for each force. The bad news is that if we analyze forces independently, we are not going to have enough statistical power for a more precise result. So we have cases like West Mercia Police Force, that is the smallest, and the Metropolitan Police Service, for its size, is obviously the one presenting more cases. The sample size of the study will depend on the cooperation of the 43 forces. We have been thinking about combining data for like big regions. For instance, here you can say Cambridgeshire, Bedfordshire, and Hertfordshire. So we have started some conversations with these forces, and they would be happy to join us in this study. So when we take all of them together, we can increase the power of the analysis and, as I said, the precision. That could happen in other regions, and it all depends on your willingness of taking part in this study. How the data extraction is going to work? Well, Paul has told you a little bit. Actually, for him it was a lot of work because he had the list of officers presenting misconduct, and he had to match this list of 100 officers with 200 who have not committed any misconduct. So we will need to repeat that process. If in your force you have 30 cases, we will actually need 90 cases. And that implies that we will combine data in the BARD list with data recorded by your force locally, probably information recorded by human resources or any other kind of database where you keep track of the behavior of a police officer. So in order to make the data extraction safe and consistent, we have been thinking about creating something like an electronic questionnaire where you can input data and we immediately can have access to the data set. That is one option. Maybe for some forces this is not the best option, but it's the kind of things we have been discussing so far. Obviously, all of these involve the use of anonymized data. We don't need to know the name of the officers involved in the barrel list or in the study, but you will be able to match the IDs with the names of the real officers, so you can keep control of these results. As I said, these small samples altogether could involve or could make it possible a study of national level. So that would be the first study. The second study is a prospective algorithmic risk assessment. So in this conference in past years, you have probably heard about the work done by Dr. Barnes, thank you. And he has used random forest as an algorithm is based on machine learning techniques that allows to predict with more precision what is happening in the future. An algorithm, it's not traveling to the future, observing what is happening, and coming back and telling you what exactly will happen in the future. It's an approximation, it's a scientific approximation that allows us to bet with evidence what is going to happen in the future. And that's the role of random forest and other algorithms like XGBoost or other forms of calculations. So we are thinking about using these predictive models that have been used for offenders at the moment, use these predictive models and these predictive tools to predict police misconduct. So in a way, it's changing a little bit the side and using the same techniques in this very harmful issue which involves police misconduct. So the algorithm we use could be random forest. As you all know, random forest gives you an idea of the accuracy of the prediction. In some cases, the prediction is very accurate. In other cases, it's not that easy. And this is because we are trying to predict minority class. Not most of the officers are presenting misconduct. It's a minority group. So trying to predict the irregular category, it's quite complex. In that sense, we are trying to think in a model that uses the 50,000 cases more or less in this way. So let's say that we have a cohort of 50,000 new officers recruited in 2018. So we will record data for all of them during 2 years. In 2020, we are going to decide to use that year as a time point for prediction. So everything which is happening before 2020 will be used as historical data, predictors, right? As Tom did. And we will try to predict based on this data, statistical analysis and big data analysis, what is going to happen 12 months later or probably 24 months later. So that is going to be the first approach, trying to use this tool to feed information into the police with the aim of trying to control the risk factors that can explain misconduct. The third study, as I said, tried to do exactly the same, but in a dynamic fashion. This is not easy to explain, so I have created a figure that maybe will make the explanation. I'm not sure. This is the first time I explain this, so you will let me know if it's working or not. So let's say that I have here in this horizontal line months. So I want to predict what is going to happen with arrest after 12 months. So I will have data from the past that I will use as a predictors to try to forecast the presence, absence of arrest or crime or misconduct after these 12 months, right? That is what I just explained in the random forest. We try to predict this in one time, but we know that the risk could change because of other factors that had been happening in the reality of our police officers. Maybe someone increased the level of education, or maybe someone has had some mental health issues. Different factors could make this prediction change in time. So what we try to think is how we can move this prediction with reality, right? So what can I predict after 12 months, after 13 months, after 14 months, after 15 months? The period of time could change. We could say years or every 6 months or quarters. When we did that in a study with around 10,000 individuals in probation, we tried to run the random forest and predict what was going to happen with them after 12 months. So the second attempt was try to move this as a slide window, what is happening a month after and another month after. And we arrived with a model like this, right? When we compare accuracy and sensitivity, say in different words, the capacity of the model to identify true positives, we realized that the model kept constant. So the accuracy was the same, the sensitivity was the same across the time. But by doing this exercise, we realized that we were missing something. Facts were happening there, right? These individuals committed more crimes during this time that we were not taking in this model of sliding window. So when we realized that, we thought about using a expanding window, right? And instead of just dropping the gray boxes, the information represented by the gray boxes, we try to introduce these gray boxes as new predictors, right? So when we introduce this information as new predictors, as fresh predictors in this expanding window model, we realized that those predictors played a very central role. So fresh information was best predictor sometimes than very old information. The other thing we realized is that even though the accuracy, the overall accuracy went slightly down, the sensitivity was increased by 10%. So when we are saying we would like to create a predictive model like a random forest, and we want to try to check if that model can work in a dynamic way, this is what we are trying to do. Allow the algorithm to be fed by new information constantly and make the forecasting more accurate. These are here the tables that I've explained. I'm not going into details here, but if you can say, for instance, this is the study with arrest, the overall accuracy in the expanding window model went a little bit down, but the sensitivity increased quite a lot. The results here are not fantastic. We would like to have predictions that are, 90% accurate, but that's not always possible. And we need to develop more strategies to work in this minority class that could be predicted. So what you can do about all this? Well, basically help us with information, taking a role and joining us in this adventure that obviously rests in the shoulders of the work developed by Paul Tomlinson as part of his MSc thesis. You can help us to collect anonymized data and also for the officers in the barred list, but also for the control officers. But the only aim is that if you are interested in joining this program of research, you can feel free to contact us. Not just Paul and I, but anyone in the team, because we will be very happy to facilitate the process.
So what we're talking about here, and what I want to get both of your comments on, please, is we're talking about a system for screening at intake and then surveilling officers while they're in service with a view to predicting that there's misconduct, which sounds great. It sounds like Minority Report. But how do we do it? What are the barriers and the challenges that we'll need to overcome, both technical and political, in terms of trying to operationalise that kind of system? Jeff, do you want to go
Make
first?
sure this is still on. Okay. The very first thing is to realize that, thankfully, in this country, this is an incredibly rare outcome. And every prediction mechanism, even random forest, suffers greatly when you're predicting something that rare. So one of the things that I presented a couple years ago was predicting killed and serious injury accidents in Australia, but the sample was everyone who got an infringement in Western Australia. So about 800,000 infringements every year, and about 0.5% ended up having a killed and serious injury accident within the subsequent 3 years. That is probably at about the limit, and even there, we were only able to find half of them going forward. So we missed half, and we identified a lot of false positives. We are eventually labeling 7.5% of all infringements as being at risk, when only 0.5% were going to produce that. So one of the things when you have an outcome this rare that you must get confident with is how many false positives this process is going to produce. And we are trying to recruit 20,000 officers, and we're having very bad luck, especially at the moment with inflation. The question is, every false positive, if we say you will not be recruited because we think you look like a barred officer, but we're identifying 10 times more than actually happened, or worse than 10 times more. How many false positives are we willing to live with when it's eating into our possible recruiting? That's a dynamic decision that needs to be made, probably as you're talking about doing like monthly cohorts. That is something that you must, you probably need to constantly readjust that. When things are getting really bad, you're probably going to have to open that gate a little bit wider and lower the number of false positives, which is also going to limit the number of true positives that you detect. I think that's my initial comment, but I think I want to hear what Sir Dennis says next. I have other comments, but I don't want to take your time. Because you're actually brilliant.
How do you deal with that? That's misconduct, by the way. Okay. There's two things that jump out of this for me. First is to chief officers and others, for goodness sake, invest in audits. We talked about RCTs, and I'm completely a fan of RCTs. Very much, particularly as Stacey said earlier, when you're dealing with high risk. But to start to shine a light on something, invest in audits. Look what your audit revealed, Paul. I don't think people will forget your presentation today, and it will have exploded some myths and anecdotes that are in people's mind, because that was the kind of cohort policing people that were recruited when they joined a long time ago in many cases. The world's changed. And you are showing part of that on there. And I think for some, particularly those who seem to get a bit of a hang-up about education, that would be particularly challenging for some individuals. So absolutely applaud that and recommend it to chiefs. But the second thing is, I think we need to really think about here, which goes to what Sarah said about, there's little agreement on the qualities we want for a police officer. It's the lens we use when we're recruiting, the way we market the job, what we think, or what's in people's minds about what they want to do when they join. And we do tend, maybe inadvertently, to flog the crime fighter, that kind of view of the world, that sort of warrior view, whether we do it unconsciously or consciously, we tend to sell that in. I mean, some join to be peacekeepers, some join to help people, but I think the real world of what police do is the key piece before you start this attempt to stem the tide and catch, something that's going to be terrible. What I mean by that is change the frame you apply when you're trying to sell policing and when you're trying to find people who will do the right thing in hazardous and difficult circumstances for everybody. That is quite a tight demand. I'm drawn to something that Larry mentioned some years ago, Clive Perrow and natural accidents. You see, I think, and I said this in the Leveson inquiry, police work in a hazardous environment. If you think about it, when police arrive at an incident, they're arriving where they're at the point of human failure or error, missing persons, domestic abuse, murder, tragedy. This, in most people's terms, if they thought about this for a moment, outside of some sort of Gilbert and Sullivan opera, this is a hazardous environment. It's an environment full of potential failure. And on top of that, you're sending people, maybe people like Jeff, or even worse, myself, to deal with it. We're human too. So now what you're doing is you're piling lots of potential hazard on top of one another. If you change the view about what the job we want these characters to do, how exceptional this job is, to do it well in all circumstances, then maybe you end up aiming to recruit people who can retain a sort of a sense of composure and mission, even under the most difficult circumstances. So that for me, and if you change that lens, particularly if you look at what you've already got in the organization and this huge recruitment drive, I mean, that's what's that going to change, about nearly 40%, well,
especially with retirements.
Yeah, if you look at the churn there, 50, 60,000 people or whatever, it's 135,000 people. This is a time of great opportunity, but you have to bring the right lens to bear on who you're recruiting. I'm totally with doing a bigger study for this, but I'm also trying to go upstream of it, and that hence the change in lens. That would change your approach. You would have an intelligent wariness about the possibility for error, not just because you've been in the HMIC, like myself, on the dark side, but because you appreciate the potential for error, and you recruit for that potential, and you support around those possibilities. I'll stop there, because I could go on forever.
Jeff wants to come back.
Well, I mean, first of all, the best slide, at least for some of us, was the one that listed West Mercia as being the smallest and the Met as being the largest. That made some of us very happy for some reason. But in addition, this one of the tricky things that you face in this monthly plan of shifting from month to month is that you don't have a triggering event in it. And so normally when I've been building these kinds of models in the past, there's some kind of trigger that says, this is a person we want to look at. And the obvious one here is, well, somebody's applied to join the police. Somebody's applied to join promotion. Somebody's gotten in trouble. There's some kind of misconduct. Now we have new information. Let's use that as a trigger and say, well, now we're going to look at everybody that had an investigation for either gross misconduct or just general misconduct. And then we'll say, okay, well, what do the next 2 or 3 years look like for them? And that triggering event lowers your data volume, because you're only looking at when each row of data is, this event has occurred, and I'm now going to look forward from that point. When you're looking at doing it monthly, you essentially say, arbitrarily, the 10th of every month is an event for everybody in the organization. So you have the Met, 35,000 officers, and you add 35,000 rows of new data every single month. And again, the outcome that you're looking for is exceedingly rare. We don't have that many gross misconducts to look at. Now, one of the solutions to that is this idea of, well, let's take this national. Let's look at everybody. The problem when you step out of one force in a fractured data environment across 43 forces is that not everybody collects everything. Not everybody collects the things that they all collect well. They do some things better in this place and some things better in this other place. And the data just doesn't mean the same thing in the way it's recorded. It doesn't mean the same thing in West Mercia as it means in the Met. And even there, if you look at something like you had A levels as one of your predictors, well, that may be recorded in both places, but it may mean very different things in one place than the other. And the statistician would just say, well, we can just put the force, we can just put the force in as a binary variable somewhere in the model and say, well, we'll just put 43 ones and zeros in there, and that'll help balance it. And it will help. In random forest, it will help. But very often, it's just better to say, we just want to build a local model on local problems. The problem with that, of course, is that when this outcome is so massively rare, way rarer than killed in serious injury accidents, then you just don't have enough if you're looking local. So it's a very challenging thing. If you go national, you've got variables that don't mean the same thing everywhere in the model, and the model will have a very hard time with that. But if you don't go to, if you localize it, you may not have the numbers.
Can I just add one small thing?
Go for it.
Doesn't it depend, though, doesn't it depend, Jeff, on where you set the threshold? I noticed you used the gross misconduct. Of course, that's relatively infrequent and highly conspicuous. I mean, all the way through to the Wayne Couzens scenario. But the stuff that's been going on social media, that is not necessarily so infrequent. And it can be very conspicuous. So I think what matters here is back to hiring the right people who do the right thing. It's the level at which you say, this is acceptable because you are likely to do the right thing, and this is not acceptable because you're unlikely to do the right thing. So anybody coming into play for alleged misconduct, let alone kind of the fatal point, really, which is gross, if I now do the parallel, the near fatal or the near misses does not elevate the possibility of predicting something that will be unacceptable to the organization, hopefully, and the public. That would be my thought.